So I recently had to light a scene on a train, and even though we had permission to film, I wanted to get lights that I could quite easily attach to the overhead baggage rack and that wouldn't take up a lot of space. I decided to try the Soonwell MT1 since it has these magnetic mounting points, as well as a lot of features for lighting, such as the ability to program in color temperature, as well as pretty cool program modes that I wanted to test out. I've always been a bit skeptical of lower end LED tube lights. Any that I have used in the past haven't really been much good, both in terms of color rendering, but also in terms of brightness and form factor. And that skepticism did carry over a little bit into the MT1. Now, initially I didn't have the best impression of this light either, and that's because the train lights were really bright, and in terms of output, the MT1 just struggled to compete. However, I decided that I'd give the MT1 another chance with some test scenes, and overall the MT1 ended up impressing me quite a bit. This light addresses most of the issues that I have with LED tube lights, and whilst it's not perfect by any means, I will say that it is far and away the best tube light that I have used. Now, before I get into the test scenes, I want to go over a few of the main features for the MT1. Primarily, I was interested in the magnetic mounting points, because it meant that you could mount this light without the need for tape or rigging. And this is massively useful if you're trying to get the light into tight or awkward spaces. As well as this, the MT1 has a tiny footprint, so it will fit pretty much anywhere you can mount it. Additionally, there are also two 1/4-20" mounting points at either end of the light. So you can use it on a light stand, or if you had a few, you could mount them to an L bracket and make a super low profile LED panel. It also comes with this little tripod and a lanyard, which, to be fair, are decently well made, but I doubt they'll really be much use. More notably, you get a male-to-male adapter, so you could, in theory, screw 2 or more of these lights together to make a longer LED tube light. There's also a frosted panel, and this is really good because it gives you a uniform spread of light, and it casts a single shadow, which if you have individual LEDs, you get strange shadows. This also makes it look much more natural if you're using it as a practical. The MT1 has an internal battery which keeps it small, and it charges over USB-C, which again, much nicer than micro USB or a coaxial charging cable or an external battery. In terms of lighting, you can pretty much get this light to do whatever you want. It has color temperature range from 1600 all the way up to 20,000 Kelvin, with options for plus and minus green to match it to any available lighting. There's also a consistent light output throughout the color range, which is really nice. If you do want to go for something a bit more stylized, you also have full control over RGBW output, as well as a hue, saturation and luminance mode, so you can pick whatever color you want. Using a light meter at 1250 ISO 1/50th of a second from 1 foot away, 100% green is the brightest at f11, with 100% blue and 100% red, both being a bit darker at around f8. You can also dim it to as low as 1%, and I was curious as to whether the panel was just telling me that there was 1% and 2%, or whether there's actually a difference between 1% and 2%. So I set up the A7S at 8000 ISO and pointed it at 18% grey to give me exposure at 1%. Then I set the light to 2%, which doubled the exposure, should in theory give me an extra stop of light, and sure enough, 18% grey was now a stopover. So you do actually have really fine control over brightness. Speaking of brightness, I think this is a little bit of a drawback for the MT1. Now, I could turn this up to max and point it at my face to give you the impression that this is a really bright light, but I could also do that with a dim candle too, with the right exposure settings and a sensitive enough camera. When it comes to light output, the only thing that matters is what the meter says. And at 1 foot away, 1250 ISO and 1/50th of a second, the MT1 only gives you a brightness of f11. It's not amazingly bright, and of course the brightness will only drop off as you get further from the light. For the most part, I do think that this light will be more than bright enough in situations where you're using fast lenses and you have full control over the lighting and exposure in a scene. But there will be cases where you have to work with either available light or where you don't have control over other lights on the location. And in these scenarios, the MT1 could end up getting drowned out. So, for the first test scene, because this light is so small and thin, I had the idea to use the MT1 as if it were light coming from outside a window. In this case, to give me a blue moonlit feel. Now, normally I would just put a light outside the window and shine it through, but that really isn't possible in an apartment. Additionally, if I were to use a bigger LED panel, I would find it very difficult to put that against the window and have it shine through the blinds to actually give the feeling that it's coming from outside. So first of all, to light this scene, I put the MT1 on the window frame, and that way I could have the light push through the blinds and interact with them as if it was coming from outside. For some stylized moonlight, I set the MT1 to a sort of cyan blue color using the RGBW setting. And I think on its own, this could work for a very dark, ominous, moody scene. But personally, I wanted to go for lighting that was a bit more conservative. So I put a CTO on my Godox SL60, and I bounced it off the wall to bring the exposure of the room up and give me some warm general fill light. Lastly, I used a desk lamp as a practical to give me some warm lighting, again to motivate that warm fill from the SL60. It also helped me avoid having just plain white walls in the background and a key light for the face. As well as this, it added contrast. And overall, I really like the look and feel of this scene, and I think that this is a really good way to push light from outside a window when you're tight on space. You would obviously need to be careful with coverage, of course, because if you point the camera at the MT1 directly, you'll see a pretty obvious hotspot on the blinds. Now, the first effect mode that I wanted to try out was the TV effect. So for this, I set up a scene with the MT1 in front of my TV. On its own, the scene looks very flat and the lighting is very harsh. Again, to give me a general ambient exposure, I used the SL60 with a softbox, and to make the background a bit less plain, I put that practical in the background again. This time, however, I also used a desk lamp just out of frame as a key light. So this matched the color temperature of the practical, and the light here was motivated by the practical, and I think this looks good. But for a more intense effect, I switched off the SL60, and this gives us the sense that she's watching TV late into the night. The MT1 also has a fire effect, and I've shot a couple campfire scenes, so I was eager to try this out. Unfortunately, I couldn't test it out with an actual campfire, but I did want to see how it would look with a candle. And as you can see, the candle itself is not giving us much exposure at all. So I set up the MT1 just right of frame, just beyond the candle, and then I put the practical light in the background again to motivate an edge light, which was coming from that desk lamp, and it helped me just fill in some of the dead space in the frame. Now, obviously the MT1's fire effect is meant for a large fire and not for a candle. And I get that candles will have a more consistent light output than a fire, but I do think that this test scene highlights a feature that would improve the MT1 quite a bit. In the fire effect, the MT1 dips down to 0% brightness regularly, which obviously a candle wouldn't do. Now, since you can change the maximum brightness of the effect, it would be great if there was also an option to adjust the minimum brightness so that you can maintain a baseline level of exposure. For this, I ended up just trying to color match the MT1 to the candlelight using the RGBW mode, and I think that this looks better. I'd probably in future have another light beside the MT1, very dim, just to give me a constant level of exposure motivated by the candle. Meanwhile, the MT1 can do all the flickering effect. Finally, I really love the gritty look of scenes lit with cheap fluorescents, particularly broken fluorescents that flicker. So I was really excited to test out the bad bulb effect on the MT1. For this, I used the magnets to mount the MT1 to my kitchen hood, and this gave me a nice harsh key light. I then put bleached muslin on the SL60, and I bounced it off the roof to give me a general top lit fill. Now, I really like the look of this footage, but the flicker effect itself isn't that convincing. Maybe I need to play around with the speed, but the problem for me is that the brightness change is just too abrupt. It sort of changes brightness in very discrete steps, rather than dimming smoothly with intermittent flickering. In addition, an actual fluorescent would also probably change color temperature and be more or less green. It's not what I'd expect a broken fluorescent to look like. I still think that this footage looks great, but the bad bulb effect itself, I'm not that convinced with. To be honest, overall the MT1 has impressed me, and I've liked it a lot more than I expected to. It's very versatile because of its size and form factor, as well as the fact that it can produce basically any color of light you might need. The user interface of the light itself is pretty intuitive and easy to navigate. And in my opinion, the MT1 is head and shoulders above a lot of the cheaper LED tube lights I've seen in the past. Whilst I do think that the brightness could be a problem in the future for some situations, and I also think that some of the effect modes are a bit gimmicky, it's still a fantastic tool to have anyway. That's just my 2 cents, so I hope that this video was useful, and I'll definitely be using the MT1 more in future. So I will see you later.